composting earth to the nourishment of insects and oak trees and squirrels, ceaselessly spreading out of itself as well as breathing the world into itself, so that it is very difficult to discern at any moment precisely where this living body begins and where it ends. So I thought it would be fun to start by sharing a piece I made during my fellowship at FOC back in 2019. While living in Provincetown, I became hyper aware of the rapidly changing landscape, from the constantly shifting shapes of sand dunes to the threat of rising sea levels. I became especially attuned to its tidal patterns, where the tidal range between low and high tide can be up to 14 feet, making for a dramatic shift in the landscape and limiting accessibility to certain areas of the Cape. Living in Baltimore City, I realized I don't always see or am as aware of such daily drastic environmental changes because the land is so built up around me. For me, making art begins by showing up and being present. Many times I find myself in a new place. It's usually something unexpected that triggers my best work. It could be random material found in a thrift shop, a person to collaborate with, or something in the environment. When I was in Provincetown, I started my time here by observing and exploring my surroundings. This was partly because a previous fellow had given me advice to take advantage of the nice October weather, saying I'd have plenty of time to hide out in my studio during the winter time. I'm sure you guys will agree that was accurate. While exploring, I started slowly documenting my surroundings without a clear idea of what I would do with it. A lot of times this can look like filming a time-lapse or sound recordings or photography. I take all this material back to my studio and start processing and playing around with it. There's a lot of time lapses I film that fail or that never get used and just take up a lot of hard space on my hard drives, but sometimes end up in pieces years later. All of this exploring and observing in Provincetown resulting in creating Turn of the Tide. Turn of the Tide is an installation and performance-based work. On the custom curved wall, a projected video of the Atlantic's oceanic tide can be seen rising and falling, filmed from the breakwater. In front of the projection, a performer is seated on a meditation cushion. The performer wears a wireless stretch sensor around their diaphragm. As the performer inhales, the tide in the projected video rises. As the performer exhales, the tide recedes. And then I have a short clip of documentation. Turn of the Tide invites viewers to consider the authority of their own somatic experience and renews awareness of our physical connection to the earth within the context of a rapidly changing landscape threatened by rising sea levels. I used blue floodlights and the sound of wind chimes to create a meditative and calming atmosphere to encourage visitors to spend time in the space. Pictured in the documentation is poet Philip Matthews, who was a second-year fellow. He has a rigorous meditation and yoga practice and would lead yoga for the other fellows some mornings. So he was the perfect performer for the piece. It was exciting to see the other fellows embrace the work while it was installed, and they would sit with the sensor and interact with the piece. Having the real-time connection of data from breath manipulating the video creates a sense of liveness and real-time connection within the work. The process of filming this time-lapse was a bit of an endurance feat in itself. I filmed for about 4 hours sitting on the windy breakwater. This process naturally leads to needing patience and settling into a meditative state. So now I'd like to share pieces from an exhibition I had at the Sculpture Center in Cleveland. I feel like this exhibition is a good representation of how I mix different mediums together. The exhibition included an interactive installation using visitors' heart rate, projected video, a live prayer plant, custom water pump, collage cyanotype prints on paper, and blue floodlights. The exhibition investigated the radical act of slowness and how slowness can be used as a device to meditate on the interconnectivity of the body in the land it inhabits. Caring for houseplants, watching the clouds roll by, and spending time in the sun and by the water are just a few examples of how we can use nature to heal our nervous systems. Gestures of a Prayer Plant features a 24-hour time-lapse of daily movements of a prayer plant. By day, its leaves are flat and open, and at night, its leaves raise up, folding like praying hands. When visitors first enter the exhibition, they see the live prayer plant by the tidal wall. While Turn of the Tide was the first instance that I actually used time-lapse in an artwork, I had begun collecting them about 4 years prior to that. These time-lapses range from landscapes to the slow observation of changing shadows in my living space. With this particular study of the prayer plant, I'm interested in how these plant movements might relate to the body and vice versa, how these circadian rhythms relate to each other, and also how to use time-lapse as a tool to shift perspective to see what we can't on our own. In this installation, titled The Clouds Move On, But I Am Still Here, visitors are invited to sit at a small table in the center of the gallery and place their hand on a heart pulse sensor. As the sensor calculates their heart rate in real time, the viewer watches a projection map time-lapse of the clouds rolling by in the sky. The playback speed of the time-lapse changes in relation to how fast or slow their heart rate is. This work creates a way to slow down the viewer and make them aware of their heartbeat by visualizing the heartbeat outside of the body and in relation to their surroundings. The work alludes to the idea of time's ability to heal. The healing power of time was on my mind a lot during this time as I was getting back into my pre-pandemic routines and was processing other grief and loss. The origins of this work had been percolating since I was in residency at the Bemis Center back in 2015, where I experienced the grand Midwest skies of Nebraska. And in future iterations, I would love to increase the projection scale even more. And then finally, this work in the exhibition, Wavelengths, is an active wall installation that uses collage cyanotype prints and a custom water pump that pumps water through the installation at 1-second intervals. The tubing is woven throughout the piece. I know it's a little hard to see because it's clear tubing, but the laser cut pattern can simultaneously resemble ripples in water, sound waves, veins, and even fingerprint ridges. I see the use of water in this piece as a symbol of healing. Just as our bodies consist mostly of water, so does the earth. And this is just a behind the scenes of the laser cutting the prints. I found when I was starting to really get into cyanotype printing, I felt constrained by the size of the paper I was using, and so I started laser cutting as a way to be able to expand the scale of the piece. Okay, so to backtrack a little, what is a cyanotype? Cyanotype is essentially translates to blueprint. With cyanotypes though, you don't use a camera to capture the image, you use the thing itself, meaning you basically capture the silhouette of the object via a contact print. The print will be white where the object was and blue where the sun hits the paper. The process was invented by Sir John Herschel in 1840 in England, but it was Anna Atkins who really popularized the process and is considered one of the first female photographers, and she was actually the first person to create a photographic book which used this technique. And earlier this week when I was in the Pam gift shop, I saw they actually had a book there featuring her work, so if you're curious, you can go check out the cyanotype selection at Pam. So I'm just going to kind of go through the process of making a print because I know sometimes it's a little mysterious. So you start by collecting plant material. You can actually use any kind of object, but plant material is what I use most of the time. Then you arrange the material on a prepared piece of paper that has the UV chemicals on it. Then you put plexi down over it so your material doesn't blow away, and then let it expose in the sun for about 10 minutes. And then you rinse it in water, and that's when it turns the beautiful blue colors. And yes, I use a kiddie pool in my studio to do this. I only recently got smart and finally got like a water pump so I didn't have to like lug buckets of water back and forth from the sink. And then you use towels to pat excess water off the print and set it aside to dry. As I got really into the process of making cyanotypes, I was thinking a lot about the oxygen cycle and this reciprocity that happens where we breathe in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide, and plants take in carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and give us oxygen. Meditating on this interconnection led to a series of cyanotype pieces I call Keeping Pace. Keeping Pace is a series of cyanotype paper-based works where I use plant foliage to build collaged imagery resembling internal nervous and respiratory systems. This piece, Synapse, uses multiple exposures. So I would, in this one, the first layer was a bunch of clovers, and then I exposed it, rinsed it out, recoated it with chemicals, and then put a lot of pine needles on top, rinsed it out again. And then I also start using the collaged laser cut elements. This one also uses the clover leaves. This one I was using a lot of grasses, pulse. The titles are verbs, not nouns. For me, it was really important for the pieces to not feel static. And it's a little behind the scenes. I was using different software to like figure out how I wanted to laser cut the elements and scale them to the right size. Also, throughout making these, I started learning I started seeing this more as a collaboration with the sun, which I really enjoy as a collaboration because I find the best prints are in direct sunlight, and it's kind of really difficult for your schedule to line up with like the perfect sunny day, like no clouds in the sky. And I also started to really notice how the shadows would change by my studio throughout the day, but also throughout the different times of year, and how certain times of year I couldn't expose in the same spot because the sun had like changed different angles. So I really enjoy seeing this process in collaboration with the sun. And this is just kind of help you see the scale of the different pieces from the exhibition I had. And in fall 2023, I had the opportunity to travel to Chile. My friend Susan Dorsey received a grant from the National Geographic Society for a project called Illuminating Seeds and asked me to be the art and technology advisor for the project. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the project because that could be like its own presentation, but the project was essentially focused on co-creating curriculum and artworks with students and teachers in the USA and Chile that illuminated their natural surroundings and connections to nature. And there's a link that takes you to like full project documentation and lesson plans and stuff like that. And we also, we did do a cyanotype lesson with the students, which was fun. So this here is like the final showcase in Chile that had prints that were from the students in Chile, but also the USA schools that we worked with. But during my travel there, you know, I'm always just like collecting, looking, observing these experiences. We stayed at this really amazing Airbnb, and when I was preparing this presentation, I realized like, wow, that kind of looks like Cape Cod. But we ended up staying on this island where you had to take a single car ferry to get there, and it was almost like a dune shack that we stayed in, and it was on this super remote beach. And one night I went out and looked at the stars, and I saw like the most amazing night sky, and these are photos I was able to take with my camera, and I was just like super in awe. I saw like the Milky Way for the first time, and so that experience of like wonder just really stuck with me. And fast forward to this summer, this past summer, I was going to my parking pad in Baltimore, and I saw this like weed growing by my parking pad, and I was like, oh, that'd make a great cyanotype. And so I harvested this weed from my parking pad, and I just started kind of obsessively making cyanotype prints with it. And there's this one print in particular that I was like, oh, it looks like the Milky Way, and it brought me back to that experience I had in Chile. And so I just started continually making a ton of these prints using the pepperweed plant. And that resulted in this piece, which I just finished like the week before I came here. It's 6 by 10 feet, and I was trying to mimic like that night sky effect that I felt in Chile. And I'm hoping to do more. I still have more prints, but I might have to wait till the summer to be able to make more prints. But I think I'd like to make more in this series. And this is just, I experimented with different ways of collaging the prints together, but kind of settled on this somewhat kind of like sewing pattern method, and I used this little sketch to like keep track of the different papers as I assembled them together. And fast forward now to here, when knowing I was coming for a printmaking residency, I was thinking about my favorite moments of making the tumbleweed prints was when the little seeds would fall off and create these little white dots on the paper. And so I thought I would come take advantage of the big printing presses here and try making monoprints using plant seeds to see if I could replicate the night sky using lots of transparent layers of ink. I really enjoy this duality of the micro and the macro, trying to recreate something so large with something so small. And so this is kind of an in-progress look at what they're looking like so far. I've got about 5 or 6 of them, and I still want to do some more layers before I leave. And there's a little detail. I'm kind of using poppy seeds and mustard seeds mostly because they have a nice round shape. And that's my last slide. So yeah, thank you everyone. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Do you have any questions for Sara?
So,
Go ahead, Vicky.
Yes, thank you.
so when you're exposing the cyanotypes, the big ones,
Yes.
Are you just like carrying them outside into the direct sunlight?
Yes. Yeah. So it's very, I found the process of making them is very laborious, but when I started really getting into this process. It was kind of the first thing I started doing kind of after like COVID lockdown. And I found it was like a really nice process to get my body moving in the studio again, and just kind of the repetition of, assembling the print in my studio, walking it down the hallway outside to bring it back in, and then rinse it out in the water. I found the process was really kind of healing in a way. Yes.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for this presentation. I have 2 questions. And the first one was if you could speak. I love this idea that you have to wait for the summer to do the really, like some of the big cyanotype projects. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to, I guess, like, to seasons or like these kinds of like rhythms in your work overall. And then secondly, I was really interested in how the monotypes that you're making right now, you're using like indigo and blue, even though you don't have to kind of mimic this like cyanotype vibe. So I was wondering whether you could speak a bit more to that, and whether, that like, whether you did think of using other colors, but then settled on this, and how that fits into your cyanotypes. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I guess in regards to the blue color, I was like, wow, this is a lot of blue happening right now. It's my blue era. I think I saw like article in the New York Times recently that was talking about like why do artists like love blue so much, because there's definitely like a history there with artists and writers. And I think one of the quotes in the article said that blue, this one person said that blue was like the most metaphorical color. And I feel like that resonated with me. And I think it makes a lot of sense because of the ocean, because of the sky. There's all these different things in the natural world that we just naturally connect with. So I think that's probably like the main thing that I'm tapping into. And then I think from like a science perspective, I believe blue is like shorter wavelengths, which create, like, I think there is a science about it, like de-stresses or calms the body behind it. So I think that's why I gravitate towards blue so much. And then in terms of like rhythms, I think, and like the ways of making work, I think, yeah, the way I've kind of structured it is in the summer, I really try to make time to just make prints, and I don't necessarily, kind of with the time lapses, I don't go in with a very specific idea all the time of what it's going to turn into. I just know I have this time to make prints, so I just go make a bunch of stuff. Like here, even in Provincetown, the first few days or like week I was here, I went to the beach a few times because I was like, one, it's sunny, and I was like prepared. I wasn't, the weather's so unpredictable here before coming. I was like, if it's sunny, I got to go to the beach and take advantage of it. So at the beach, I was just doing all these like sand prints and stone prints, and I can show you all in the print shop if you're curious what they look like. But, I don't have a necessarily like specific plan for that. And again, kind of the fun thing with cyanotype and maybe just printmaking in general is you don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to turn out until you've run it through the press, you've like washed it out in water. And I think for me, I really enjoy that kind of like unexpectedness that happens. Because to me, I think I get a little bored if I know exactly like what it's going to look like in the end.
I was just curious, your work with like somatic kind of therapy, I'm just curious like where that came from, like if you have a background in that, or if it's like about a belief of like that kind of body work or therapy like being more accessible or intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what's going on with that?
That's a good question. I feel like I really started to kind of tap into that kind of line of thinking during COVID, and I read this book called Breath, and it was all about kind of the science behind breathing, and that's where I learned about the vagus nerve, and also this book called I believe it's Grandmother's Hands. Your Grandmother's Hands, I believe, that also talked about the vagus nerve, and I was really interested in how breath is used, like this vagus nerve like runs throughout your whole body. So I think it just turned like into a personal interest, and at the time I was also going through, pandemic things, and my parents went through this really dramatic divorce during this time, and when I started doing therapy, I started learning all these like somatic exercises you can do to kind of re-regulate your nervous system. So I think it stems from that. Yeah. So you mean like when I take prints and decide which ones to collage? Oh yeah, like let me go back to it. That's a good question. I think maybe like 20, but then I still have pieces of other ones, like, the pieces, because I don't use maybe the full print in it, because I cut out parts of it. I think for me, I was loosely, it's somewhat, I would say, just gut instinct, but also I had this idea like of kind of like how the Milky Way kind of runs diagonally across the sky. I started by kind of the one towards the middle, like picking ones that were brighter or had more detail in them. I was looking at the detail and grouping those together, and then I wanted maybe the ones more along the edges to, be more subtle or have less detail. So that was kind of my thought process. And I'd somehow kind of try to match some of the blue hues together, because, the blue is not always the exact same shade when the print turns out. But I definitely start by making more than I need, and that helps with being able to pick and choose what I feel will work. And then in terms of the previous Keeping Pace series, that were the smaller pieces, I was kind of working on those all at the same time and rotating them around. And I started with a loose idea. Once I had gathered all these prints, then I went back and kind of created a more concrete idea of how I wanted to kind of arrange each one. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.